Hello student, I am Professor Smita Jha from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, and I am here to discuss the topic Decadence, the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And as we are dealing this with Victorian literature, so let us discuss one of the most important literary pieces of the Victorian era. Well, decadence means a state in which people behave in a way regarded morally bad according to the societal conventions. The adjective for decadence is decadent. It has nothing to do with the word decade, which means 10 years. Decadence comes from the Latin word de, meaning from cadir, meaning to fall. Thus, it means to fall from a higher state of being. So this is very important to know the meaning of decadence, to know the essence of literary pieces written during the time. So the term decadence is used to denote a state where society, which once used to be good, has gotten corrupt. Public behavior in this age comes off as shocking and often revolting to the previous generation of society. It stops functioning as before. Of course, not everyone will agree regarding what is good or bad, but some societies, such as Sodom and Gomorrah, are thought to have been decadent. In terms of literature, decadence represents a period of decline or deterioration of art or literature following an era of great achievement. Examples include the Silver Age of Latin literature, which began about AD 18 following the end of Golden Age, and the Decadent movement at the end of 19th century in France and England. Théophile Goethe and Charles Baudelaire are credited for first using the word in this context. The latter used the word decadent to describe himself in Les Fleurs du Mal. The term was later used when he spoke about the destruction of categories of art and literature, according to 5 phases of modernity. And these are modernism, avant-garde, decadence, kitsch, postmodernism. It was in 1884 that a specific group of writers came to be referred to as decadents. These were those who were heavily influenced by the work of Baudelaire and Gothic literature. A well-known quote by Arthur Symons states that these authors were attempting to give sensation, to flash the impression of the moment, to preserve the very heat and motion of life. In the past, decadence has also been considered a parent category of symbolism and impressionism. Both groups share a common interest in the work of Baudelaire, such as La Fleur du Mal. These groups also held similar beliefs, such as a rejection of nature as a source of inspiration for art. But this meant different things. Nature was banal in the eyes of symbolists, and they used natural imagery to elevate the reader everyday life. But in the decadence movement, nature was belittled. Decadence as a literary category is often linked with the excessive refinements found in the literature of the late Roman period. Its general characteristics are an interest in perversity, ennui, art for art's sake, transgressive modes of sexuality, artificiality, and decay. As the century continued, in France, the level was increasingly applied to a type of poetry exemplified by the writing of Paul Verlaine and Stéphane Mallarmé and the fiction of J.K. Huymans. By the end of century, decadence had spread into many other European countries as an aesthetic term. Decadence became a vital force in England during the 1890s. It thrived as one of the dominant focuses of a wider cultural debate regarding degeneration and, in particular, the fin de siècle, a decade and an idea with which it became increasingly associated. The periodical, The Yellow Book, was seen as one of the chief organs of decadent writing. And Oscar Wilde, Arthur Symons, and Ernest Dowson are usually cited as the leading writers in the English decadent tradition. However, much work in recent years has focused on expanding this canon, particularly with regard to its gender bias. Along with aestheticism and symbolism, which are the literary categories with which it often overlaps, decadence has become a vital focus within literary study of the Victorians, and it now appears secure as one of the major strands of teaching and research in the literature of the period. There is a dilemma here, for despite the plethora of general guides of decadent literature, there is no single overview of decadence as a global phenomenon, as most of this type of work tends to be limited by national or at best continental boundaries. Students of Victorian literature looking for a European context, however, will in all likelihood be most interested in France, and many guides to English decadence tend to contain material on this. Robert Louis Stevenson novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, published in 1886, achieved great success, selling over 40,000 copies within its first 6 months of publication. It is a Gothic story of Gabriel John Utterson's investigation into a series of occurrences between the respected Dr. Henry Jekyll and the nefarious Mr. Hyde. The novella explores themes of supernaturalism, the duality of self, and the importance and consequences of public opinion. The structure of the novel is both complicated and interesting. Stevenson splits the novella into 10 chapters, each given a unique title. These are A Story of the Door, Search for Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll Was Quiet at Ease, The Carew Murder Case, Incident of the Letter, Remarkable Incident of Dr. Lennon, Incident at the Window, The Last Night, Dr. Lennon's Narrative, and Henry Jekyll's Full Statement of the Case. The titles show us how tension is built in the novel towards a climax in chapter 4 and 8. The complex structure is in part because of the number of different narrators. Utterson narrates the bulk of the novel before we get Lennon's account and then finally Jekyll's. This must be the case because if we heard from Jekyll before this, then the mystery would be revealed. To understand the context of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in terms of decadence, you need to know something about the author's background and the times in which he wrote. Robert Balfour Louis Stevenson was a Scottish novelist, short story writer, and poet. The author was born in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1850. His family included engineers, scientists, a professor of philosophy, and a religious minister. We can see the scientific and religious sides of Stevenson's family reflected in both his life and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Stevenson was a qualified advocate but earned his living as a writer. He was chronically afflicted with tuberculosis. Thus, Stevenson was a sickly child, and his ill health was one of the reasons he spent long hours reading about travel and adventure. He dabbled with various psychotropic drugs such as alcohol, cannabis, and opium. A combination of his love of adventure and troubled disposition led him to spend many years as a writer, traveling the world in search of a climate that was healthier than Britain's. In 1890, he even went to live in the remote Salmon Island in the South Pacific. Stevenson is well known for his dark and sinister tales. His popular works include short stories like Markham, Throne Janet, and racy adventure novels such as Treasure Island and Kidnapped. Successful and famous, he died at a young age in 1894. Interestingly enough, Stevenson later claimed that the plot of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was revealed to him in a dream. R.L. Stevenson's novel The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a prominent example of Victorian fiction. The novel can be explored from the viewpoint of dualism as a system of philosophy, as a religious framework, and also from the viewpoint of Freud's structural theory of the mind. Dualism derives from the Latin word duo, meaning two. Simply put, dualism can be understood as a thought that facts about the world in general or of a particular class cannot be explained except by supposing ultimately the existence of two different, often opposite, and irreducible principles. Dualism is most often discussed in the context of the systems of religion and philosophy. The strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde deals with Dr. Henry Jekyll, who is widely respected, successful, and possesses a brilliant intellect, but is only too aware of the duplicity of the life that he leads and of the evil that resides within him. Dr. Jekyll covertly provides utterance to the evil in his soul by various unspeakable acts, but is afraid of doing so openly because of the fear of social criticism. In the course of his experiments, he succeeds in producing a connection that enables him to free this evil in him from the control of his good self, thus giving rise to Edward Hyde. Edward Hyde is pure evil and immoral. Not only is his psyche different from Dr. Jekyll, but also his body is grotesque and deformed. Thus, Dr. Jekyll thinks that he can receive the pleasure that both parts of his being crave without each being encumbered by the demands of the other. However, Mr. Hyde evokes feelings of dread and abhorrence in Dr. Jekyll's friend who beseech him to give up his friendship with Edward Hyde. Edward Hyde gradually becomes even more powerful than his good counterpart and ultimately leads Dr. Jekyll to his doom. Jekyll and Hyde, as an eponymous term, has become a synonym for multiple personalities in scientific and lay literature, and the novel has also been considered a case demonstration of substance dependence. Dr. Jekyll says, with every day and from both sides of my intelligence, the moral and intellectual, I thus drew steadily to that truth by whose partial discovery I have been doomed to such a dreadful shipwreck, that man is not truly one, but truly two. He further adds that I learned to recognize the thorough and primitive duality of man. If I could rightly be said to be either, it was only because I was radically both. He describes Mr. Edward Hyde as a second form and continents substituted, nonetheless natural to me because they were the expression and bore the stamp of lower elements in my soul, and that Edward Hyde, alone in the ranks of mankind, was pure evil. Thus, Stevenson creates in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde two equipotent, coexistent, and eternally opposed components that make up a normal individual. At first, Jekyll controlled the transformations with a serum, allowing him to indulge in his darker impulses through Hyde's unrestrained and uncaring persona without detection. However, one day Jekyll involuntarily became Hyde in his sleep, causing Jekyll to decide to cease become Hyde. Frightened, he tried to occupy himself with friends and social activities, but Jekyll gave in to his impulses and transformed into Hyde once more. Hyde, enraged by Jekyll's repression of him, killed Danvers. Horrified, Jekyll renounced any more transformations, but it was too late. Jekyll became Hyde while walking in the park, wide awake, afraid that he would be discovered by the police in this condition. Hyde wrote to Lennon in Jekyll's handwriting, asking him to bring him chemicals from his lab that would change him back into Jekyll. Lennon died from witnessing Hyde's transformation into Jekyll. Meanwhile, Hyde began emerging more frequently. This exhausted Jekyll's supply of chemicals as each transformation required even larger doses to revert Hyde back to Jekyll. This forced Hyde to experiment with various combinations of drugs to no avail. Jekyll speculated there was some impurity in the original batches that allowed his transformations to work. Here, good and evil are not related, but are two independent entities. individuals even, different in mental and physical attributes and constantly at war with each other. Evil now does not require the existence of good to justify itself, but it exists simply as itself, depicted as being the more powerful, the more enjoyable of the two. And in the end, ultimately, it is the one that leads to Dr. Jekyll's downfall and death. In the novel, there is a considerable difference in size between Jekyll and Hyde. Hyde is much smaller than Jekyll, and this is most notable when his small body is found in the clothes of Jekyll. As Hyde represents the evil side of Jekyll, this size difference suggests that the author views this side of the human character to be in some way lesser than the good and rational side. Hyde is also described as being younger and more energetic than Jekyll. This suggests that this side of human nature develops later in life after a period of childhood innocence. It also suggests that Stevenson felt that this side of human nature was more exhilarating and energetic than the higher, more respectable side of human nature. This is also illustrated in the novel, where Jekyll describes how much he initially enjoyed being the Hyde persona. But Dr. Jekyll, in the last phases of his lucidity, recognizes the danger that Mr. Hyde poses to society and altruistically decides to do away with himself. Stevenson seems to discard Christian notions of monism and impress dualism as described above. The novel needs to be looked at in the context of its setting of Victorian London. Stevenson seems to make a comment not only about the dualism present in every individual but also in society as a whole. In the Victorian London, the aristocracy that superficially was gentle and refined had dark secrets to hide behind the high walls of their mansions. Most of the action takes place in the night time, and much of it in the poorer district of London, considered the abode of evildoers. Most significantly, Mr. Hyde enters and leaves Mr. Jekyll's house through the back door, which seems a metaphor for the evil that lies behind the facade of civilization and refinement. Dualism as a philosophy signifies the view that the universe contains two radically different kinds of being or substance, matter, and spirit, body, and mind. The ancient Greek distinguished profoundly the soul and the body, as the dictum states. The body is a tomb. Evil, therefore, was a result of an infinite soul trapped in a finite body. Plato, for instance, was strongly dualistic in that he expressed the view that the soul exists independently of the body. The rational soul is a spiritual substance distinct from the body within which it dwells, much like the chariot and the charioteer. Dualism served a great purpose in the European Renaissance when Descartes described the mind exclusively as a substance that thinks and matters exclusively as an extended substance. This dualism enabled a wholly mathematical science of physics to come about, where every fact in the material world was to be explained on the basis of measurements. The issues raised in the novel also find resonance with the Freudian concepts of life and death instinct and the structural theory of the mind. Freud defined instinct as a concept that is on the frontier between the mental and somatic, as the psychical representative of the stimuli originating from and reaching the mind, as a measure of the demands made upon the mind for work in the consequence with its connection with the body. Freud developed the theory of instincts about the concept of libido and the consequent foundation of the psychosexual phases of development. However, aggression as a component of the libidinal drives became increasingly important and could not be ignored. It was therefore elevated to the status of a separate instinct. It was further realized that humans were neither exclusively nor essentially good. Freud introduced his final theory of life and death instinct in 1920. Freud postulated that the death instinct is a dominant tendency of all organisms and their cells to return to a state of inanimateness. The death instinct represented the aggressive instincts, and Freud later separated the libidinal and aggressive instinct from the ego and located them in a vital stratum of the mind which is independent of the ego. This line of thought led to the further differentiation of the psyche as per the structural theory into the id, ego, and superego. The characters in the novel manifest characteristics of the structural theory of the mind. Mr. Hyde would seem easily recognizable as the id, seeking instant gratification, having an aggressive instinct, and having no moral and social mores that need to be followed. He takes pleasure in violence. And similar to the death instinct ultimately leads to his own destruction. Dr. Jekyll is then the ego. He is conscious and rational and is dominated by social principle. Dr. Jekyll has a difficult time juggling between the demands of the id, represented by Mr. Hyde, and the superego, as represented by the proclaimed and implicit morals of Victorian society, which prided itself on refinement and goodness, and is shocked by the seeming nonchalance with which Edward Hyde indulges in his debaucheries. In the novel, Dr. Jekyll gives in to his impulses, and after initial pleasure, soon cannot control their power. Rather than let Mr. Hyde go free and realizing that Hyde needs Jekyll to exist, he decides to end his own life. Further, by leveling Mr. Hyde as troglodyte, Stevenson seems to make a comment on the theories of evolution and that he considered Hyde, that is, savage, uncivilized, and given to passion, poorly evolved. Edward Hyde represents a regression to an earlier, less civilized, and more violent phase of human development. The noveller's popularity propelled by morbid curiosity of the human capacity for violence and brutality. Despite being a chilling shocker, it was an immediate and worldwide success that spawned a stage production only a year after its release in 1887, as well as numerous television and film adaptations in the subsequent decades. It is a chilling and enduring tale of mystery, deceit, and revelation, which shocks the readers and confronts them with their own moral reflection. Arguably, that makes the story is the idea that everyone has at least a bit of Hyde inside, contained or ignored, but is still there. That maybe we are all capable of murder under the right circumstances. At various junctures in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Stevenson uses vivid descriptions to evoke a sense of the uncanny and the supernatural and of looming disaster. He first employs this technique in the opening scene when Enfield relates his story of witnessing Hyde trample a little girl, a night when the streets were so empty that he began to long for the sight of a policeman. This notion of the city as a fearful landscape also recurs throughout the novel. After hearing the tale of Mr. Hyde, Utterson suffers from dreams in which Hyde stalks through labyrinths of lamp-lighted city, crushing children and whispering evil into Jekyll's ears. In Utterson's vision, London becomes a nightmare city, a place of terror, where Hyde can perpetrate his crime unchecked. The nightmare city reappears in Utterson's later, waking description of London, leading the police to Hyde's apartment through a foggy pre-dawn. Utterson watches the mist swirl and transform the neighborhood into a district of some city in a nightmare, bringing a touch of terror even to the solid policeman. The setting of Victorian London looms large in the background, adding to the macabre atmosphere. Fog penetrates the streets, mirroring Jekyll's own inner darkness. The city becomes an echo chamber for Jekyll's turmoil. Utterson, in his pursuit of the truth, stumbles upon gruesome trail left by Hyde. Among the horror is the murder of Sir Danvers Carew, a well-liked parliamentarian. The grisly crime propels Utterson deeper into investigation. He uncovers a link between the two men that he cannot ignore. Each clue adds to the complexity of the case, pulling readers through the layered narratives. Utterson confronts Jekyll about his connection to Hyde but is met with resistance. Jekyll's insistence on privacy heightens Utterson's concern. Tension mounts as Utterson becomes more desperate to save his friend from the clutches of evil. By the novel's final scene, these city escapes connote not only terror but also foreboding of even more horrifying dangers. When Poole fetches Utterson to Jekyll's house, the wildness of the night and the empty streets fill the lawyer with a crushing anticipation of calamity. In all these descriptions, Stevenson creates a perceptual dread that reinforces the conceptual horror of his subject matter. Much of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is written in a brisk, businesslike, and factual way. Dry and forthright, the text often resembles a police report more than a novel. This colorlessness derives in part from the personality of Mr. Utterson, through whose eyes most of the story is told. Proper and upright, Utterson approaches the events with a desire to preserve any possible trace of orderliness or rationality in them. But the narrative's dry manner also seems to arise from the text itself. The original title of the novel, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as well as chapter headings including Incident of the Letter and Incident at the Window, reveal an attitude of scientific detachment within novel's structure. When the text presents the letters of Lennon and Jekyll almost as if they were pieces of evidence, the story itself seems to become something of a scientific proof. The attitude of formality and propriety in the narrative contrast sharply with its mystical and uncanny content. With its prim demeanor, the text could be seen as attempting to repress or deny the subject matter that lurks inside it. Stevenson implies that a similar dynamic is at work in Victorian Britain, which he inhabits and portrays. The phenomenon plays itself out on the individual scale as well. Of course, the existence of Hyde in the novel testifies to the existence of an evil or primitive aspect within each one of us, just barely hidden beneath a polite, unruffled exterior. Thus, A Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson is a narrative about the complexities of science and the duplicity of human nature. Jekyll's detailed confession reveals a duplicitous lifestyle. In public, he tried to maintain his reputation as a respected doctor, but always feared his true nature would be exposed. In private, he practiced his vices, believing that if people are capable of having separate identities, then they can occupy separate bodies. The novel raises profound questions about human nature. Jekyll's struggle symbolizes the conflict we all know, navigating between virtue and vice. The horror of transformation reflects the societal repression of desires. In this light, Hyde embodies the consequences of unchecked indulgence. The novella also delves into themes of morality and the impacts of guilt. As the narrative unfolds, Jekyll's actions lead to catastrophic consequences. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde also addresses themes of alcoholism and substance abuse, reflecting the heated debates of Stevenson's time. The transforming draught created by Jekyll could mean alcohol, as consuming in turns him into violent and unpredictable figure, a concept thoroughly examined in Thomas L. Reed's study, The Transforming Draught. Additionally, some scholars suggest that the draught may represent other drugs, such as opium or cocaine. One could purchase cocaine and opium from the local chemist in 1880s London. There is a speculation about whether Stevenson was under the influence of drugs while writing. Some accounts claim he used cocaine to complete the manuscript, while others suggest he took ergot, a precursor of LSD. In Elaine Sholter's interpretation, The Strange Case of Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a fable of Findlay's sickle, homosexual panic, the discovery and resistance of the homosexual self. She notes that Jekyll's fascination with Hyde reflects the late 19th century upper middle class eroticization of working class men as ideal objects of desire. In this light, the novella served as an allegory for the double lives many homosexual men in Victorian society led. Thus, the final revelation in the novella exposes not just the connection between Jekyll and Hyde, but the darker truth within societal expectations. A climactic moment occurs when Jekyll, confessing his horror, acknowledges that Hyde is his true embodiment. He writes, "I had come forth an angel instead of a friend." So Stevenson, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, remains a cornerstone of horror literature. With its intricate portrayal of human duality, it resonates with timeless relevance. It invites readers to ponder their inner struggles and societal masks. The compelling characters, intricate plot, unsettling atmosphere create a haunting reflection. Ultimately, the novella acts as a chilling reminder of the darkest corner of the human psyche, enduring long after the past page is turned. With this, I wrap up the discussion of this Decadence novella, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Let us meet in the another lecture. Till then, thank you very much.